So guys, we're going to talk about I'm just going to do a quick video that show you how to do a SSH authentication using an external Radius server. So in this case, it will be the WinRadius server on PCA. Okay, so we're going to use router 1 to do an external Radius server authentication on PCA. Now, before we begin, some information. So I hope that you have watched the previous video to set up the WinRadius server. So it should look like this. The services is running, everything is up and running. It's listening on port 1812 and 1813, and you have successfully added a user for testing. Okay, so if you think it's working, you can use the Radius test program on the desktop as well, like what I've done here. So connect to the WinRadius server. This is the pre-shared key. Take note of this pre-shared key, WinRadius pre-shared key. Okay, because when talking to the Radius server, we need to make sure that you are an authorized client. So that's why here, if you want me to do something for you, you must be my authorized client. So this is the pre-shared key to recognize that you are an authorized client. So now, once it's set up, we say, hey server, could you authenticate this user on my behalf? So when we do send, you can see that if it's successful, you will get a reply that says this user has been found and the password that was supplied is also correct. So before we begin, the only thing I want to ensure is that make sure you go and configure the IP address of PCA to have the default gateway, because in my previous video I only added 192.168.1.3 for the PC. So just make sure you go back to the network interface there and configure the default gateway of 192.168.1.1 for the rest of the lab. Okay, so let's go to router 1. Okay, now for router 1, I've already created some basic configuration. Okay, what are some of the basic configuration? Well, as you can see, the host name has been set up, R1. Now the IP address, the appropriate IP address according to the topology, okay, according to the topology diagram. Okay, the information, I've already set it up to 192.168.1.1. okay, and then I've already set up a local username, okay, and I've set up a SSH process, okay, for us to do local authentication. Okay, and then the enable secret password is Cisco 456. Okay, so before we begin this external authentication, we're just going to do a quick test. Okay, so let's close everything off. So leave the Radius server on. Okay, so there's a PuTTY client here. So we're going to, okay, connect to 192.168.1.1 router 1. Okay, now we're going to use the local authentication as a baseline test. Alex, okay, Cisco 123. It's successful. If I do enable and 456, I would have become a privilege mode, and I can do show run, for example. Good. So now that we know that PuTTY is able to successfully connect to router 1 using SSH, we're going to, okay, modify SSH. Here we're going to create an external AAA server for SSH authentication. So what are the steps involved? Well, the first thing that you have to do is enable the AAA services using the command AAA new model. Now then after that, you have to register the individual servers into the system. So using the command Radius server, whatever name, identify this external server, which ports they are going to use, which Radius ports they are going to use, and more importantly, the pre-shared key that they are going to use to do authentication. If you want the server to do something, you must know the pre-shared key so that the server recognizes you as an authorized client to query it for information. Okay, now if you want to, hypothetically, you can create another server. So let's say on the lab there's another Radius server, so you register the other Radius server, BBB. The next command is to bring all the external servers that you have created under one roof, under a group. So we're going to use the command AAA group, okay, server radius. So normally in my mind, I call it AAA Radius Server Group. Okay, I give it the group name and I put in the individual servers that was registered previously, AAA BBB. So server name AAA, server name BBB will now be grouped under Radius Server Group 1. Okay, now then we're going to create a AAA authentication login profile. Okay, profile which makes use of all the services that we have defined. So in this case, I'm going to create a AAA authentication login profile called SSH1, in which we will be using the external group of servers for external authentication, as well as local authentication if we cannot communicate with the external server. So be it for whatever reason, if this one failed to reply to us, then we will eventually resort to using the local database as our authentication source. And of course, lastly, you need to apply the authentication to the appropriate login services. So in this case, you could be doing line console login or VTY SSH login. So in this case, we're going to go for the SSH login authentication SSH1. So we change from login local to login authentication SSH1, which means that whatever login that will be coming through to SSH will be subjected to this set of external and local authentication. Okay, so let's begin the configuration. So step 1, so let me half the screen so that we can follow along. Okay, we can follow along. Okay. Okay, so let me move the screen a bit, okay, so that we can follow along. Okay, so let's have a look. Configuration T. So let's begin. AAA new model. Okay, then after that you need to register, okay, the individual servers. Okay, so let's give it a twist. Radius Server. So the name of that is server 1, let's call it. Okay, so the address of this server is address IPv4 192.168.1.3. The authentication port is 1812 and the accounting port is 1813. Okay, what is the pre-shared key? WinRadius. This is very important. If your password is wrong, the server will not work with you because you don't know what is the pre-shared key. So afterwards, we're going to create the Radius server group. Okay, so whereby all the individual servers are going to be grouped together. So the server name would be S1. Okay, so I've created a server S1, so the S1. So if you have another server that you have registered, then you can be S2, S3, up to you. But here I only have a group of 1 member. Okay, now after that, what must you do? So we're going to create the AAA authentication profile, okay, for all login activity. Okay, anything that has to do with login will be using this profile. So I call it SSH1. So let's just call it SSH Z. Let's SSH 2, just for easy, just to have a twist. Okay, so anything that will be using login will be using this profile, and this profile is called SSH2. The group is group 1, okay, or local authentication if we cannot talk to this external group 1. We always do this step because sometimes there could be network outage whereby the device cannot talk to the servers. Because if that happens, you'll be left in limbo, never being able to log in to your routers. So that's why, as a contingency plan, if there's some kind of outage and you lost connection to the Radius servers, we will be resorting to using a local database for authentication. And finally, we're going to apply the authentication to any of our login services. So in this case, using the login services, authentication, SSH2, okay? So remember, whatever this may be, XYZ ABC, so this is just a name. So I just call it, okay, 2. Okay? So now let's test it up again. Okay, so let's now test it up. Okay, go back to PCA. So inside PCA, I'm going to enable PuTTY again. Okay, so 192.168.1.1, remember router. Okay, now, okay, so before we continue, see whether we can change the font. Let's change the font, change settings, okay, make the fonts much easier to read, okay, appearance, font quality. So this is just a side distraction, don't worry about that. So for recording, I just want to make it bigger, easier to see. Okay, login. Okay, so see anything I can do to make it more visible. Appearance, change. I'll make the font. Let me change the font. Okay, so make it nicer. Okay, so remember previously it was Alex, okay, Cisco 123, the local credential. But if I do that, you will see that they would wind up sending this information to the Radius server for authentication, and there is no Alex username password in there, so it will fail. Okay, so let's eventually get out of it. Let's fail a few times and get kicked out. So you failed again, because normally SSH, they'll give us 3 chances, right? So after you failed the 3 chances, they should kick you out. Okay, so they'll kick out the session. Okay, now let's try again this time round. Remember, okay, 192.168.1.1. okay, remember here I have a dummy user called test. So let's double check. Query username of test. I have a dummy account called test, and the username password is test. So let's open test. It is successful. Cool. So even now I proceed enable Cisco 456 using local as. Okay, now I can do the full authentication. Cool. Can't you see that it's working? Okay. Now let's close this and try again. But this time round, okay, we're going to close the WinRadius server. Okay, we're going to close the WinRadius server. As you can see in this example, if anything happened to the set of WinRadius server, then we will resort to using local authentication. So as you can see now, the WinRadius server is not running. So let's say it is not running, right? So 192.168.1.1. okay, so Alex Cisco 123. So it will take longer because the first choice is they will try to talk to the Radius server. So they will try and try and try and try. Okay. Eventually, when they realize that the external Radius server is not available, then they will resort to using the local database. That's why it took a bit longer. Okay. 456. Should run. Okay. So remember, the local component here, okay, the local component here, okay, will only work if we fail to communicate with the external server. If the external server is available, my local username password Alex will be rejected because it is not on the list. Okay, so this one is used as a fail-safe. Okay, so that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks guys.